Okay, so thank you, Maya, for inviting me and for allowing me to present this work, which has really grown out of a collaborative project that we've been working on at UCL Anthropology and also at the National University of Mongolia. And our project began in 2014, so almost 6 years ago now, when Mongolia was experiencing this really intense period of rapid economic growth due to mineral extraction. So there were foreign investors flooding the country, digging everywhere, and there was great excitement about the potential of these kind of activities. But just as we started our project, it was a sort of tipping point, and we could sense that things were changing, and very rapidly, after only a year or so, people were referring to things as an economic crisis. So that's a Mongolian term. Idin zasagin chamdral, they were using the term crisis. So really, for the duration of the 5 years of the project, we've been looking at how this so-called crisis has been understood by people, but also how they've sort of intervened into this atmosphere of crisis in different ways. And a major feature that has come to characterize this climate of change or crisis is that it's very much allowed for a reflection on past promises and a radical revision of what the future may hold or what indeed is desired for the future. So while on the surface, many continue to engage in what we've come to think of as sort of prefigurative speech. That's a kind of language that tries to bring certain worlds into being. Outside of this more dominant discourse, there's been a space created for more heterogeneous kinds of critiques and visions of the future. So in a way, I'm seeing the temporality of this period in very spatial terms as a kind of area in which things can be questioned. So attending to this space in my own research, I've mobilized a term that was used by one of my informants, and she referred to this space as the gap. So the gap between predicted economic growth and what has actually happened. So this is a gap between what was promised when the economy was skyrocketing and politicians implemented a host of very rapid neoliberal reforms, and what has actually transpired as a result of those reforms. And the gap between thinking that if one did certain things, so if one adopted certain forms of financialization or business ventures, certain outcomes would happen or materialize, and what's actually happened, which for the majority of people, as well as for the nation, has meant lots of debt. So the slippage between these two things can be only perceived retrospectively by looking back in time at what was anticipated. And here I'm using very much Wagner's term, where he mobilizes this idea of a reciprocity of perspectives. So looking back at things in order to understand the present. Seeing this space as a gap requires a certain theoretical commitment that allows us to apprehend things from a different angle. Rather than viewing people as subjected to policies and forms of financialization that replicate the world over, through this concept of the gap, I want to attend to the way that such encounters also allow for different and variegated responses and openings, a bit like what Maya was describing in her micro-freedoms or critique of micro-freedoms. This is to show how the gap between predicted outcomes and those realized actually provides a space for revelation and clarity in a world that sometimes moves too quickly for us to fully comprehend. So there's no doubt that the last 5 years have been both dramatic and disorientating for people as they've been sort of submerged in a period of rapid economic flux. But in spite of this, they've begun to see the contours of a different kind of landscape. And this has given rise to the articulation of very nuanced forms of critique and a desire for something different. And in doing so, I think we can begin to discern the way in which new worlds are deliberately being brought into being. So in my book, I use this ethnographically derived term to think theoretically about how people come to revise these anticipated outcomes and rethink what they want in the present. And I'm going to hopefully show today how it sort of opens up new ways of thinking about the future, channeling anxiety and crisis into a sense of clarity and hope along the lines very much outlined by Miyazaki when he talks about the way narratives of hope may revitalize and reorientate our knowledge. Indeed, in many cases, anxiety over this rapidly fluctuating economy provides a kind of vigor or energy, as described in the Symposium's description, leading people to actively seek new ways of imagining the future. So rather than holding people in forms of, in a sort of climate of crisis and fear, it actually opens up new ways of thinking about the future. So in my book, I focus on the lives of 5 women from different socioeconomic backgrounds who've come to occupy this kind of gap in very different ways. And I'm going to very briefly touch on 3 of them today. So one of the immediate outcomes of living through this kind of fluctuation or period of economic flux that I've been describing is that people have become increasingly critical of the idea that democracy as a system of governance can bring about progress, which is something that they feel is often propagated by international donors and financial agencies that have flooded the country for more than 20 years. So since the 1990s, when Mongolia first committed to the idea of democracy, many felt that it was just a matter of time before they caught up with foreign countries whose political system they'd now joined, and that there was a sort of linear step-by-step progress towards development. However, given the dramatic stops and starts over the last few years, many now reflect that progress through democracy isn't a kind of single line. Instead, they see a path that winds, drops away, falls out of view, only to re-emerge again and be lost for something else. So while many still kind of hold dear this concept of development or hukjil, they think that democracy is not the system by which to achieve this, which they consider to be very corrupt, chaotic, extractive, and full of inequalities. In fact, many lament that perhaps democracy itself isn't the right or correct path. The last few years have been full of different contradictions, indeterminacy, and precarity. So it's in this context that I introduced my first woman, who's called Borma. I'm sorry, I don't have any photos. But Borma's in her 50s, and she's been involved in politics and business most of her life. And she's currently running a real estate agency in the capital. However, her office, I found out quite quickly, was mostly a front for a political religious movement that she runs with her husband and friends, and it really is involved in questioning current political structures and exploring alternative forms and processes. So following her and her religious movement, we learn about the way in which, and very much I think similar to Maya, there's this sort of digging down or an archaeological vision of the future. Their religious movement involves finding out about your 13th century soul and gaining knowledge about this soul as a kind of template for who to be in the present. And there are hundreds of followers of this movement who then use these templates as ways to imagine new forms of political engagement in society at large. So really these soul templates or deep archaeological templates provide a kind of figure for them to think about how to act in the future, experimenting with new forms of governance and subjecthood. Now, I should say that Burma is very much, she's extremely politically astute, and she's part of an educated elite. She was educated abroad during the Soviet Union, but she sits at the forefront of a kind of political consciousness that's very critical of politics at the moment. And it's often one that's dismissed by those in power as a kind of populist nationalism. So I need to highlight that. So nevertheless, there's a growing number of people who are bored of hearing politicians talk about things like foreign direct investment, freedom, and the market. These are kind of terms which have dominated political language for some time, and they're very much disillusioned with the promises of economic growth associated with large-scale mining and foreign investment. Levels of corruption and deceit fuel the view that people in power can't actually carry the nation, and allegations of bribery, corruption, and fractions characterize politics, which has come to be determined by what people refer to as the invisible side of the economy. So in this context of disillusion with general politics, Burma's religious movement and political ponderings are a kind of direct outcome of life in the gap. This is a space afforded by the so-called economic crisis, allowing for an opening or a way of rethinking what has come to pass and indeed what is needed for the future. And this is a space located in between this kind of anticipated future and the reality of that future as it's now materialized. And really, their work is about sort of speculating and thinking through what could be a sort of possible way of reimagining politics. Now, it's important to highlight that in the course of my fieldwork over the last 5 years, the gap was only just becoming perceptible as a specific period of time. And Mongolians are really apt at giving names to different time periods, but no one had actually referred to it as anything apart from a period of economic crisis. So taking this term as a sort of starting point is actually to refer to it as the gap, as my friend did, is to sort of isolate and define a space of expectation now thwarted and an attempt to describe actually what's in its place. You know, it was sort of seen as a potentially a rapidly a space that would change very, very quickly, but actually I think ethnographically it's important to dwell in that space in its own right. It's to marshal an ethnographic concept as a theoretical tool to open up a space that might otherwise pass our attention. So rather than see this period as a place of thwarted dreams and disenchantment, which is a narrative that we're all very familiar with ideas about neoliberalism, inspired by my interlocutors, I've chosen to focus on the way in which people forge new paths in this space, which is a practice that also allows them to reevaluate past beliefs and ideas. So I'm taking this approach because it was presented to me as an ethnographic fact by my informant, but it's also a deliberately political act because it's sort of to give attention to a space that was thought of as fleeting. So attending to the way in which these 5 women who make up the core chapters of the book forge a life in spite of these thwarted predictions allows me to highlight the creative ways in which people make a life through exposure to these myriad forms of financialization that leave them in debt, networks of corruption that seem to work against them at every corner. It's to show how people work hard to prefigure or to deliberately try to live a life that they would like to come into being, a future that they want as part of individual ethical projects. So this isn't to suggest, and I think Maya also touched on this a little bit as well, that people are simply free to choose whatever futures they want, but that optimism, as Laurent Bellon has commented, is a scene of negotiated substance that makes life bearable, even as it presents itself ambivalently, unevenly, and incoherently. So amplifying this idea of optimism in a context that could be viewed as very exploitative and desperate is important because, as Robbins has highlighted, we need to pay attention to the fact that people who appear to be suffering in a myriad of different ways must also imagine better ways to live, and we need to amplify them. So this is a kind of provocation to push us out of these easy, homogenizing forms of explanation that see people subjected in similar ways the world over to forms of inequality. And it is instead to heed what Singh calls to attend to the acts of noticing things on the edges. And this allows me very briefly to introduce my second person, who I'm going to talk about today, who's called Doya. And she lives in the, I should say that all of these people who feature in my book I've known for the past 20 years. So they're very good friends of mine. And when I give these snapshots, it's only like just the surface of who they are. But she lives on the peri-urban settlements of Ulaanbaatar's slums. She's only done that for the last 10 years. She used to be the postal lady in a countryside village on the Russian border. But she works full-time at a state nursery where people leave their children in the morning and sometimes don't return until 10 at night. She's also, crucially, a single mother to a teenage son and the sole carer for her blind mother. Having just got this job in the state nursery, she doesn't want to miss a day of work, because every day that she attends work culminates to a monthly stamp that she gets from the state to be able to claim her pension in a few years' time. But unfortunately, recently she was diagnosed with cancer and had her womb removed, and she has to travel by bus to the hospital once a week in order to receive treatment, and also pawn her jewelry and various items that she owns in order to raise the funds for her medication. So she's involved in lots of complex financial arrangements in order to be able to live and care for the people that she looks after. Very much, so following her in the chapter, we learn of the pressures of intergenerational care, the movement of people from the countryside to the city, and the difficulty of accessing different kinds of state provision. Unhinged very much from her natal networks, she becomes dependent on the state and is constantly trading in favours in order to live and survive. And her life jumps from one kind of anticipated event and decision to another, rather than accumulating time. So she's very much in contrast to my previous figure, Burma, who was digging into the deep past in these 13th century souls for sort of exemplary ways of being in the present. However, instead of being pulled down by these kind of conditions, she's constantly calculating new ways to secure the care and welfare for those around her. And this is something that I've come to think of very much as a kind of ethical calculus. So she's constantly ruminating, thinking, taking decisions, making risky choices about how to generate the funds needed in order to springboard herself, her son, and her mother into a different kind of future. Indeed, her choice to move away from familiar networks into a world that is new and insecure doesn't just mean an unhinging of things, it's also a way of providing a myriad of different kinds of opportunities and relations for her family. And she's also herself, a lot of what I'm looking at is the formation of different forms of subjecthood, and she's also herself transformed in the process of doing these things. Securing the care for her family, she also becomes the centre of different kinds of possibilities and change. So I hope that we can begin to see now how attending to this idea of the gap can both be an ethnographic as well as a theoretical marker. Pausing in this space and to the line that joins the past and the future together, it's not the past or the future, allows for a kind of reflection or a shift in perspectives of movement and speculation. So this is what Wagner has referred to as the reciprocity of perspectives, whereby a particular moment allows for a sort of simultaneous looking back and forward at the same time. And it was just under such circumstances of simultaneity, looking back and forward, that the past few years were thrown into relief, and as they were becoming perceptible for people in a way they hadn't quite been able to grasp before. In doing so, it also allowed for a space in which to envisage new kinds of futures and rethink previous trajectories of progress. So it's in this context, it's important to ask why people came to use the term crisis to describe what was going on. In her book, Anti-Crisis, Reitman highlights that while crisis is an omnipresent sign in almost all forms of narrative today, we need to explore what work the term crisis plays in the construction of narrative forms. Often, moments of crisis are defined as moments when normativity is laid bare, when partial knowledge claims are disrupted, critiqued, or disclosed. So in many ways, the term crisis plays the same role as the term the gap that was mobilized by my friend. For many, this was, and here I use another Mongolian term, a bursting moment that kind of showed the economy was going too fast, ideology couldn't keep up with reality, and people reflected that this allowed for them to kind of recalibrate and take stock and re-establish more realistic goals. So crisis here was a kind of productive in that it allowed for people to think through things that were going too fast. So, and it also gave rise to pervasive critiques of democracy that were very much born out of this idea of crisis, enabling, as Miyazaki would call it, the production of new kinds of knowledge. However, on the other side, it's equally important to note that Reitman also draws our attention to another feature of crisis, and this is that she says it's not always something to be claimed, but a kind of latency. Crisis, she argues, is not a condition to be observed, it's an observation that produces meaning. So here we see the performative aspect of the term crisis as a point of observation that produces its own meaning, giving a kind of reading of a situation in its own image. So we're trapped in the conceptual parameters. We can either have crisis or not crisis, or anti-crisis as she calls it. However, what might be termed a prolonged crisis narrative has also taken hold, and this reminds me a bit more of Maya's work that she was talking about earlier. And this prolonged crisis narrative allows people to engage in sort of extended discussion and critique about how things should function. So here the idea of crisis aligns much more with the idea put forward by the anthropologist Henrik Vai, where crisis is not so much an event or aberration, but it can be a kind of open field that has come to characterize the norm. This is, a feature of late capitalism that we're probably all familiar with, that doesn't necessarily signal critical change, but it's rather the idea that crisis has become a sort of the norm. It's not a moment or aberration, but it becomes the norm. And this is very much where Berlant's work on cruel optimism is interesting, because even though crisis becomes the norm, it holds a certain cruel optimism within it. Let me see. I have examples of the way in which people manage crisis on a day-to-day basis in personal settings. Won't go on to that. So this brings me to my third subject, Delgarma, and she is a state worker for the Department of the Environment, posted in the northeasternmost countryside province to manage water reserves which are constantly threatened by mining companies, and it's a job that no one really wants. But she very much embraces the challenges and difficulties of her position with an energy and ingenuity unlike anyone else. And she describes, I think a bit like Maya's informants, that there's a sort of a moral dissonance between her generation, she's also in her 50s, and the way she approaches work and new projects and the society in which she currently exists. And it's precisely, but however, what I want to argue is that it's precisely this new kind of society that has allowed her to exercise this way of being and living, giving her the space to advocate and fight for the values that she believes in. So while the world she inhabits changes rapidly, she's able to hold on to certain moral ideals that she believes in and wants to remain the same. So she's very much, in many ways, an exemplar for the change that she critiques, because it allows her freedom from the chains and networks of remaining in place. So highlighting this is to draw attention again to this space between that which has been promised and hopeful and that which actually materialized, and actually to show the heterogeneity that is able to flourish in these moments. So the point I want to stress here is that there's not only ruination when these kind of structural financial models and economic predictions fail to materialize. There's a myriad way in which different outcomes are also born out of such failures. For many in Mongolia, this moment of economic crisis, or Edinzisking Khamral, was a sort of bursting moment or a crisis moment that allowed people to reflect and relocate political and economic truths. But it was also the beginning of a new kind of normal. Indeed, as previous progress narratives have now lost traction, it is becoming possible to look at things differently and see where new futures are beginning to come into being. So taking this approach is to make this idea of the gap, formulated by my friend, the foreground, rather than relegating it to a sort of temporary line which joins two time periods together. It's not before boom and after bust, but it's actually to say this is a time period in its own right. And it's to recognize that it's a space for the emergence of new kinds of conceptual and ethnographic ground. It's to stress, as Berlant has done, that people create alternative worlds within the forces that try to hold them in particular ways, using a kind of cruel optimism that flourishes in spite of people's realization of their compromised attachment to a world that attempts to hold them in a particular place. And it's very much to prefigure, as someone like Borma does, a future that they want to come into being through different kinds of practices. It's to work hard at maintaining relations between networks of individuals, as it is for Doya, so that life can move forward. And it's to move forward, as Delgarma does, in spite of a sense of sort of moral dissonance with the world around you, even if those ways are themselves facilitated by the context of prolonged crisis that you vehemently want to distance yourself from. So I hope in these very brief examples, rather than see the gap in Mongolia as a place of thwarted dreams and disenchantment, a narrative that's all too familiar with ideas about neoliberalism and boom-bust economies, like my informants, we can also choose to focus on the way in which people are forging new lives and subjectivities in spite of futures that have failed to materialize. In fact, it's only in doing so that we can observe the new worlds that are being brought into being on the edges of things, as Singh would say, and maybe in spite of, or perhaps because of, these wider structural failures, making them the center or ground from which broader figures or futures can emerge. Thank you.